Rain hammered the windows of the Meridian Diner. The night a woman with a bruised cheek crawled beneath the counter and begged a stranger not to give her away. She was 27, thin as a coat hanger, her waitress uniform hanging loose on shoulders that had learned to fold inward, and her hands shook so badly she'd already dropped one tray that shift. The man she was hiding from would walk through that door in 90 seconds, wearing a police badge and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Every regular in that diner suddenly found something fascinating in their coffee cups. Every single one, except the man in the corner booth. He sat alone the way powerful men sit alone, back to the wall, a charcoal suit still damp from the storm, a heavy signet ring catching the neon light every time his fingers moved. His name was Salvatore Baroni, and in certain rooms across Chicago that name could empty a table or fill a grave. 34 years old. Silver already threading his dark hair at the temples, a scar running pale across the back of one hand. He'd come to this forgotten diner off the interstate for the one thing his money couldn't buy him anywhere else, an hour where nobody called him boss. He hadn't finished his coffee yet. He never would, not that cup. Because a bruised woman was pressing herself into the shadows beneath the counter, and something in her eyes, that particular animal stillness he'd seen only once before in someone he couldn't save, was already pulling him out of 12 years of careful silence. He set the cup down. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply watched the door and waited for the man with the badge to make the first mistake of his life. If a story about the quietest person in the room, turning out to be the bravest, moves you, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's step back into that rain-soaked diner and find out exactly what she was running from. The shadowed space beneath the service counter was only about half a meter wide, crammed with boxes of napkins and a mop bucket emptied of water, and yet Delia Warren still found a way to press herself into it, her knees pulled all the way up to her chest, both hands clutching the faded cloth bag, as though it were the only thing still keeping her tethered to the earth. Her breathing came brokenly, short and shallow, the kind of breathing of someone who had learned long ago that crying out loud was a dangerous luxury. The smell of burned coffee and cold frying oil had soaked into her hair, but the scent she recognized most clearly in that moment was the smell of her own fear, that bitter metallic taste gathering at the base of her throat whenever she knew he was coming close. Ruth Adler, the 58-year-old woman who had stood behind that counter longer than most of the regular customers had been alive, was the first to see Delia's old shoes sticking out from the darkness. She didn't startle. She didn't ask questions. She only leaned slightly, pulled the cleaning rag hanging over the edge of the counter a little lower to cover the gap, then stepped a few inches to the side so her body stood between the entrance and the corner where Delia was hiding. Every movement she made was smooth, neat, without a single wasted motion, and the hand she placed on the edge of the steel counter didn't tremble by even a vein, as though she had acted out this scene so many times that it was no longer a reflex but a habit. Delia looked up at her through the darkness, and in that moment she didn't understand why a stranger knew exactly what to do, why those aged eyes looked at her not with curiosity, but with something almost like recognition, as though Ruth had seen her face somewhere before, on another woman, on another rainy night. Ruth bent down, pretending to pick up a fallen spoon, and when her face passed across the shadowed opening, she spoke in a voice low enough for only the two of them to hear, telling her to stay right there, not to move, not to make a sound, that everything would be all right. Delia pressed her lips together and whispered 5 words as thin as steam clinging to glass. "Please don't let him see me." And those 5 words, the way they were spoken not like a sudden plea, but like a sentence that had been repeated thousands of times inside her mind, until it had gone smooth, drifted across the space of the diner, and reached the man sitting in the corner. Salvatore Barone did not turn his head. He didn't need to turn his head. 20 years of living in a world where the smallest sound could be a sign of the worst possible thing had taught him how to listen without looking, how to let an entire room print itself into his mind while his eyes remained fixed on the cup of coffee steaming before him. He heard the girls breathing beneath the counter. He heard the false calm in Ruth's voice, and when he lifted his gaze, his eyes met the eyes of the woman standing behind the counter through the thin smoke curling up from the coffee cup, a look that lasted no longer than 2 seconds, but carried an entire wordless conversation between two people who had seen too much to need explanations from each other. Ruth did not ask him for help. She only looked at him, and in that look there was a silent question. What kind of man would he be tonight? The kind who turned away, or the kind who did not? And Salvatore, who had turned away only once in his life and had paid for it for 12 years, felt something old and heavy shift inside his chest. He had done nothing yet. He only set his fingertips against the rim of the cup, feeling the last warmth slowly leaving the porcelain, and let the dangerous stillness of the moment fill the space between heartbeats. Outside, the rain was so heavy it had turned the parking lot into a black mirror smeared with light, and right then, a dark sedan with no markings, no sign of belonging to any official police department, slid into the lot and stopped crookedly across 2 parking spaces, its headlights tearing through the sheet of rain before snapping off. Inside the diner, no one said anything. The cook in the kitchen stopped moving over the griddle. An elderly couple at the table by the window suddenly became deeply absorbed in the menu, though they had ordered their food half an hour ago. Ruth straightened her back, placed both hands on the counter, and drew in a very slow breath, like someone accustomed to keeping her voice steady while her heart was pounding out of rhythm. Beneath the counter, Delia heard the car door shut outside, a dry, hard sound cutting through the rain, and her whole body went rigid. She knew those footsteps. She had memorized them the way people memorize the breathing pattern of a storm, not because they want to, but because survival forces them to. And Salvatore, who still had not taken a single sip of coffee, finally moved his eyes from the cup and directed them straight toward the door, waiting for the man who was about to cross that threshold, waiting for the moment he knew with certainty, with the instinct that had followed him all his life, would decide how tonight would end. The glass door flew open with the jingling of the wind chime fastened above it, and along with the rush of cold, damp air came a man carrying the smell of rain, the smell of leather from his expensive coat, and another scent harder to name, the scent of authority accustomed to having others move aside. Bradford Kessler walked into the Meridian Diner, the way a man entered a place he assumed he had every right to enter, broad-shouldered, back straight, chin slightly lifted, his eyes sweeping over each table with the calm of someone used to controlling every room he stepped into. He was about 41 years old, with neatly cut blonde hair, a square clean-shaven jaw, and on his belt, revealed just enough beneath the open front of his coat, an inspector's badge glinted under the diner's sickly yellow neon lights. He stopped in the middle of the aisle, brushed a few drops of water from his shoulder with a slow and calculated gesture, then smiled, and it was a smile practiced so carefully that it was almost perfect, warm, friendly, exactly the sort of smile worn by a decent man who was worried. Yet, the expression remained entirely superficial, failing to mask the cold, calculating look of someone counting every head in the room. From the corner of the counter, Salvatore Barone watched all of it without moving. And while most people in the diner saw only a courteous police officer looking for someone, he saw something else. He saw the mismatch, the tiny distance between words and truth, that only people who had lived their whole lives among lies could recognize. Kessler moved closer to the counter, greeted Ruth in a carefully adjusted, warm baritone, the voice of a man who knew that gentleness was a more effective tool than threat, and began telling his story, a story so smooth that it could only have been the product of repetition. He said he was looking for his ex-wife, a poor woman who wasn't mentally stable, that she had run away from home during a panic episode, that she had a tendency to injure herself and then blame other people, and that he only wanted to find her and take her back somewhere she could receive proper care. As he spoke, he pulled a neatly folded stack of papers from the inside pocket of his coat, a divorce petition with official stamps, and a medical form printed with the name of a psychiatric clinic, all of it displayed with the gentle movement of a man, certain that paperwork always won, that as long as there were enough seals, the truth could be rewritten. Ruth took the papers, lifted them under the light, and read them longer than necessary, not because she believed them, but because she was buying time, keeping her face as neutral as the surface of a frozen lake. Then she set the papers back down on the counter, pushed them lightly toward him, and said in the rough voice of someone who had smoked cigarettes and poured coffee for 4 decades that she was very sorry. But no woman like that had come into her diner all evening, that on a rainy night like this the place had been quiet, and she had been standing here since opening, so she knew exactly who had come in and who had gone out. Kessler tilted his head, still smiling, and for one very brief moment, so brief it almost didn't exist, that smile stalled, a hairline crack running through the perfect mask, and Salvatore caught it, the way the fingers of his right hand tapped lightly against the counter, in a rhythm that was not leisurely at all but impatient, the way his eyes flicked down very quickly toward the floor behind the counter, before he managed to pull them back, the way his throat moved as he swallowed something that wasn't saliva, but restraint tightening around impatience. Salvatore had spent his entire life reading men like this. Men whose danger did not lie in their fists, but in their ability to make an entire system believe their version of the truth. And he recognized that the man wearing this badge belonged to the worst kind, the kind that had learned to turn the law into a personal weapon, the kind that could stand before a judge and shed tears timed precisely to the second. Kessler spoke again, this time his voice a little lower, a little sweeter, saying that he understood the owner was only trying to do the right thing, that many kind-hearted people had been deceived by that woman's tragic stories, that this was exactly what made her condition dangerous, and that if Ruth truly cared about her safety, she should let him take her home. Every word he spoke was wrapped in the sugar coating of false concern, and it was that very sweetness that made a chill move down Salvatore's spine, because he had heard this tone before, not from Kessler, but from other men in another life. Men who always knew how to make hurting another human being sound like an act of mercy. Beneath the counter, less than a meter from Kessler's polished shoes, Delia held her breath, pressing both hands over her mouth. And Salvatore, still sitting motionless in the corner, with the coffee cooling in front of him, finally spoke, cutting through the badge wearing man's flawless performance with a sentence so calm that the whole room seemed to stop breathing. "The coffee here gets cold fast, Inspector," Salvatore said, his voice low and even, no louder than necessary, but not so quiet that it could be ignored. "You should leave before it goes completely cold." The sentence fell into the air like a stone dropped onto still water, and Bradford Kessler turned around, noticing for the first time that evening the man sitting in the corner of the counter, the man he had, until that moment, treated as if he were part of the furniture. He looked at Salvatore, and Salvatore looked back, and between the two men there was a silence so dense that the rain striking the glass door suddenly sounded sharp and clear. Kessler assessed him the way one predator assessed another, taking in the charcoal-tailored suit still damp from the rain, the heavy signet ring on his finger, the way he sat with his back against the wall and a view of the whole room, and the way his two hands rested still on the counter, not because he was relaxed, but because he was disciplined, the kind of stillness found only in men who knew exactly what they could do when necessary, and had learned not to do it unless they had to. Kessler's practiced smile faded by a few degrees, and he said, his voice still holding its polite surface, while something beneath it had begun to harden, that this was a police matter, and that the kind gentleman in the corner shouldn't interfere in a family matter he did not understand. Salvatore did not answer right away. He lifted the coffee cup, looked into the dark liquid that had gone cold and begun to form a thin film across the surface, then set it back down without drinking, a slow and deliberate gesture that forced Kessler to wait, and in the world where Salvatore had grown up, making a man wait was a way of declaring who truly controlled the room. "I understand family matters better than you think, Inspector," he said, "and what I understand most clearly is that when a man has to carry an entire stack of papers to prove he's decent, it's usually because that decency doesn't show on its own." Kessler blinked only once, but Salvatore caught it, the instant the mask wavered, the flash of cold anger behind those pale blue eyes, before it was pressed back down beneath the surface of professionalism. The man wearing the badge stood there for a while, weighing, calculating, and Salvatore could almost see the numbers moving behind his forehead, the calculation of whether he should push forward or step back, whether this stranger in the corner was an obstacle he could brush aside, or something far more dangerous than he had expected. And then Kessler made the decision of a clever man, because men like him were always clever about choosing the right moment. He backed down. He gathered the papers from the counter, folded them neatly, and slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, with the same calculated leisure he had used when taking them out. Then he adjusted his collar and flashed another mask of polite reassurance, though his jaw remained rigid with unspoken tension. He told Ruth that he very much appreciated her cooperation, that he would leave his card in case she remembered anything, and he placed a white business card on the counter with an almost tender carefulness. But before turning away, he stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice had lowered, just enough for those nearby to hear, and all warmth had evaporated from it, leaving behind something flat and cold as steel. He said this was a small world, that news traveled quickly, that people who hid someone running from the law sometimes discovered that their own lives had suddenly become strangely complicated, business licenses reviewed, surprise inspections, little troubles piling on top of one another until they buried a person. He said all of it while still smiling, still using the tone of a man merely sharing useful information, and it was precisely that contrast between his words and his tone that made the threat more chilling than any shouting could have been. Then he looked at Salvatore one final time, a look that said this was not over, that he would remember this face, and he turned, walked out of the diner, the glass door closing behind him with a jingle of the wind chime that sounded strangely sour in the air stretched tight as wire. Through the rain-soaked window, they watched his shape cross the parking lot, climb into the dark sedan, and sit there for a long while without starting the engine, simply sitting like a patient animal that had caught the scent of prey and knew that time was on its side. Inside the diner, no one dared breathe too loudly. Ruth stood motionless behind the counter, her fingers finally trembling slightly as the tension began to drain away, and beneath her feet, in the cramped darkness, Delia was still pressed into the corner, her eyes squeezed shut, her whole body shaking violently, not yet daring to believe that the most dangerous moment had passed for now, not yet daring to believe that the stranger in the corner had just done what no one in the past 4 years had ever done for her, stood between her and her fear. Without demanding a single explanation, the dark sedan finally started after nearly 10 minutes of motionlessness, its headlights tearing through the rain once more, before it slid out of the parking lot and disappeared into the soaked darkness of the highway, and only when its taillights had vanished completely did Ruth breathe out a long breath, the breath she had been holding in since the man with the badge walked in. She came around the counter, locked the glass door from the inside, flipped the sign hanging there from open to closed, then bent down beside the cramped dark space and softly called that he was gone, that she could come out now. Delia crawled out from beneath the counter slowly, every joint stiff from having been folded for too long in a position no human body was meant to hold, and when she straightened beneath the neon lights, Salvatore saw her face fully for the first time, the left cheek swollen and bruised purple, a small cut at the corner of her mouth dried into a dark streak, and her eyes were what made him stop, because there were no tears in them, no loud panic, only a cold and exhausted vigilance, the look of a creature hunted for so long that it no longer knew how to relax. She stood there with her back pressed against the counter, her eyes darting quickly between Ruth and the strange man in the corner, and Salvatore understood at once that she didn't trust him, that gratitude and suspicion were tearing against each other inside her, because in her world every kind act from a man so far had only been the opening note to something worse. Ruth poured her a glass of water, and Delia reached to take it, but her hands shook so badly that her fingers couldn't tighten around the glass, and the tumbler slipped from her grasp, falling to the tile floor and shattering into small bright pieces beneath the light. She flinched hard, immediately bending down, both hands fumbling to gather the shards, her mouth stammering apologies. "Sorry, I'm sorry," the reflex of someone who had learned that even the smallest mistake could bring consequences, and the way she shrank into herself, the way she hurried to take blame for an accident that was no one's fault, told Salvatore more about the last 4 years of her life than any story ever could. He rose from the corner of the counter. He did not move toward her suddenly, but slowly, keeping his distance, the way a person approached a wounded animal without frightening it more. He stepped around behind the counter, and Ruth, understanding him, moved back to give him room. He took the rag hanging over the edge of the sink, bent down, and began wiping up the spilled water and gathering the broken glass with his own hands, doing the sort of work a man like him would supposedly never touch, a man whose name made an entire city hold its breath. Delia froze in the middle of her movement, looking up at him in pure confusion, not understanding why this man was kneeling on the floor cleaning what she had spilled. Then he stood, took a clean cup from the rack, filled it with hot coffee from the pot, and set it on the counter in front of her, pushing it gently toward her, all in silence, without a single word. And it was that moment, the moment a man poured her a cup of coffee, and pushed it toward her without asking for anything, without attaching a condition, without a searching look, that made something break open inside Delia's chest, because it had been 4 years, 4 long years, since anyone had poured anything for her. She had always been the one pouring, the one serving, the one bringing things over, and then quietly disappearing, and this small, simple gesture, performed by a stranger in a diner on a rainy night, touched a deep place she had thought she had locked away long ago. She looked at the steaming cup of coffee, then up at his face, and for the first time, her guarded eyes revealed a flicker of something else, not trust. It was far too soon for trust, but the astonishment of someone who had just been reminded that kindness still existed in the world. Salvatore stood quietly, and when his gaze accidentally fell to his own hand, the hand with the white scar crossing the back of it, and knuckles that had once done things he would never speak of, something old shifted inside him, a passing feeling too vague to take shape, the feeling that it had been a very long time since he had used these hands to do something gentle instead of cruel. And with that feeling came a shadow sliding along the edge of memory, a face, a voice, something he had failed to do, but it dissolved before it could become clear, leaving only a painful echo that he hurriedly pushed away. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was low and calm, saying that the man would come back, perhaps not tonight, but certainly he would come back, and that staying here wasn't safe for her, nor was it safe for the kind woman who had protected her. He said he knew a place where no one could find her, and that she didn't need to trust him. She only needed to believe that staying here was the worst thing she could do right now. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building on Taylor Street, a quiet street where the streetlights were sparse, and most of the windows were pitch black at that late hour, and Salvatore brought Delia there through twisting alleys he had chosen for a reason, avoiding the main avenues, avoiding intersections with cameras, moving by the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life learning how not to leave a trail behind. It wasn't where he lived. She realized that the moment she stepped inside, because the apartment carried the clean emptiness of a place kept ready for situations that might require it: minimal furniture, a sofa, a table, a small kitchen with a few basic supplies, not one photograph, not one personal trace, the kind of refuge only people who lived in danger ever thought to prepare in advance. He showed her where she could rest, showed her the door latch and how to lock it from the inside, placed on the table a paper bag, holding a few things to eat that he had bought quickly on the way, then stepped back and kept his distance, always kept his distance, as though he understood that for someone like her, the closeness of a strange man was more frightening than loneliness itself. Delia sat down on the edge of the sofa, still clutching the worn cloth bag tightly in her lap, and watched him without ever taking her eyes away, that vigilance never truly going out, and between them stretched a long silence that he did not try to fill. He walked over to the window, drew the thin curtain aside, and looked down at the rain-soaked street below, standing there for a long time with the brooding air of a man whose body was here, but whose mind had drifted somewhere else, and almost more to himself than to her. He said that he had gone to that Meridian diner regularly every month for many years, always to the same table in the corner, always with the same cup of black coffee, a habit he had never explained to anyone, and didn't intend to explain. And there was something in the way he said it, a tightly compressed heaviness, that made Delia understand that the shabby diner by the highway meant far more to him than a place to drink coffee. Though she couldn't guess what that meaning was, she didn't ask. She had learned long ago that asking about a man's past was dangerous, and instead she only said softly, her voice small and hoarse from so long without using it much, that she had once had a place like that too, a place she kept returning to, until she realized that the places we keep returning to are the first places people go when they want to catch us. And she told him, not exactly told him, but let a fragment slip out, that she had changed her name 3 times in 4 years, had lived in 4 different cities, had learned never to leave an address, never to use the same name on 2 job applications, because he was a cop, and a cop knew how to find people in ways ordinary people could never imagine. That sentence hung in the air, revealing just enough for Salvatore to understand that this woman wasn't simply a victim running away, but someone who had survived a pursuit that was methodical and well-resourced, that the man searching for her had an entire system in his hands, and that made the situation far more dangerous than he had expected. And just then, the phone in his coat pocket vibrated. He looked at the screen, then walked to the corner of the room, turned his back, and answered. The call was brief, and he said only a few words, but when he ended it and turned around, his face had darkened a little, and Delia, who had spent her whole life reading the smallest changes on men's faces because her survival depended on it, knew at once that something was wrong. He told her without hiding it, because he felt she deserved to know the truth instead of being soothed by comforting lies, that his people had just reported that the man with the badge was searching across the city tonight, that he had already gone to 3 hospitals, 2 rooming houses, and 1 bus station, asking about a woman who matched her description, that he was calling in his connections and moving far faster than a man who was merely looking for an ex-wife. Delia heard those words and tightened her hold on the cloth bag in her lap, and Salvatore saw fear return to her eyes, but this time, beside the fear, there was something else beginning to appear, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. The thought that perhaps, just perhaps, for the first time in a very long while, she did not have to face the coming storm alone. The next morning, when the gray light of a damp November day filtered through the fogged windows, Salvatore sat in his private office on the top floor of a building he owned near the harbor. A large room with a dark wooden desk and a view overlooking the murky gray river, and before him stood the man he trusted most among those who were still worth trusting, a man who had worked for him since the early days, a man who could dig up information in ways even the police would envy. He had given the order the night before, right after leaving the apartment on Taylor Street, that he wanted to know everything about the man with the badge named Bradford Kessler. Everything, without missing a single detail. And now the results lay on the desk before him in the form of a thick file that the other man set down, with the expression of someone who knew that what he was about to present would not be easy to hear. Kessler, it turned out, wasn't merely a brutal cop who abused his ex-wife, but a link in something much larger and far filthier, a network that had operated quietly for years, specializing in trapping innocent people, manufacturing false evidence, and then using that very evidence to extort, to coerce, and to silence anyone who threatened their interests. Salvatore's man turned through the pages one by one, showing him the diagram of that network, names connected by thin ink lines, money flowing through intermediary accounts, cases staged so carefully that no one had ever suspected anything, and Salvatore listened in silence, his face motionless as though carved from stone. But inside him, the familiar cold anger was beginning to rise, the kind of anger that did not explode but froze solid, the kind of anger that knew how to wait. Then the man turned to another page, a list of the victims Kessler's network had destroyed over the past 3 years, people who had been framed, wrongfully imprisoned, stripped of their jobs, their families, and their dignity, and Salvatore's eyes moved over each line until they stopped on one name, and he went still. Eddie Vance. He read that name twice, 3 times, as though waiting for it to turn into another name. But it remained there, black and clear against the white paper, and with it came a flood of memories he had not thought about in a long time. Eddie Vance had been one of the dock workers at Salvatore's own harbor, a man around 50 years old, his back already slightly bent from decades of carrying loads, a quiet and gentle man who always arrived early and left late, always lowering his head in greeting whenever Salvatore passed through the loading area. 3 years ago, Eddie had suddenly disappeared from the payroll, and at the time Salvatore had only heard vaguely that the man had gotten into trouble with the law, some kind of drug case, and in the world Salvatore lived in, a worker being mixed up with drugs was not something he considered worth his attention, so he had not paid attention, had let the matter drift past like thousands of other matters. But now, looking at that name lying in Kessler's list of victims, Salvatore understood the truth, that Eddie Vance had never been involved with drugs, that he had been framed, set up, crushed by the same machine that was hunting the woman in the apartment on Taylor Street, and that it had happened right under Salvatore's nose, to one of his own people, while he had been busy looking the other way. That discovery changed everything, because until this moment, interfering in Delia's situation had still been a choice for Salvatore, an act of conscience he could consider, and from which he could still withdraw. But now it was no longer like that. Now the man with the badge had touched someone who belonged to Salvatore's world, someone who had depended on him, and whom he had failed through indifference. And in the unwritten code Salvatore had lived by his whole life, that was a debt that had to be paid. He ordered his man to find out where Eddie Vance was now, whether he was still alive, whether he was still in the city, and the man nodded, saying that the strange thing was that Eddie Vance was actually still working, that after being released from prison, he had come back to look for work at the harbor, and had been hired again. And Salvatore sat silently before that information, because he knew with certainty that he was the one who owned that harbor, that his own system had taken Eddie back without asking about his past, even though Salvatore himself had not even known it had happened. He looked out at the murky gray river beyond the window for a long while, watching the rain break against the glass in heavy, rhythmic streaks, and when he looked back, there was a new light in his eyes, the light of a man who had just realized that the battle he was about to enter was no longer a battle for a stranger, but a battle for all the people that machine had crushed in the dark, and that among them was a man named Eddie Vance, a man he should have protected 3 years before. Salvatore met Eddie Vance late that afternoon, in a quiet corner of the harbor, where the stacked containers rose high enough to shield them from the river wind and from curious eyes, and the man of 50 walked toward him with the cautious manner of someone not used to being personally summoned by the boss, his rough, weathered hands twisting together in front of his stomach, his stooped posture lowered out of the habit of decades spent carrying heavy loads. When Salvatore said he knew what had happened 3 years earlier, that he knew Eddie had never been involved with drugs, that he knew it had all been staged, the face of the man who looked older than his years first hardened with wariness, then slowly softened and sank as though a burden he had carried alone for far too long had finally been seen by someone. Eddie told his story in a low, flat voice, without a trace of drama, the restraint of a man who had retold his pain inside his own head so many times that it no longer made him collapse, only left him tired. He said that one morning 3 years earlier, the police had stopped his car on his way to work, that they found something in the trunk he swore before God he had never seen, that the man leading the arrest masked his frigid, calculating gaze behind a practiced, friendly grin, and that no matter what Eddie said, no matter how he begged, no one was willing to believe the word of a dock worker against the word of a decorated inspector. He said he lost his job that very day, that his wife of more than 20 years couldn't bear the disgrace and the whispers and had left, that when he came out of prison after 14 months, he returned to an empty apartment, a stained name, and the feeling of a man erased from his own life. He said all of it without shedding a single tear, and it was that very calmness that made the story heavier than any sobbing could have been, because it showed that the pain had lived with him so long it had become part of him, like his permanently slouched frame and the hardened palms of a lifelong laborer. Then he told the last part, the part that made Salvatore fall silent for a long while, that when he came out of prison and went everywhere looking for work, and no one would hire a man with a record, he came to this harbor as a final desperate attempt, expecting nothing, and the foreman here, after listening to him, had simply looked at him for a while and said that in this place, a man was judged by how he worked, not by a paper in a file, and had hired him back that very day. Eddie said he had never known who was truly behind that policy, who had created a place where a man rejected by the whole world could still find a position and a little dignity again, but he had promised himself that if one day he ever learned who that person was, he would find a way to repay that kindness. Salvatore listened, and he did not tell Eddie that he was the owner of the harbor, that his own system had saved him without Salvatore even knowing it, because something inside him felt unworthy of receiving thanks for a good thing he had done by accident while abandoning Eddie at the exact moment Eddie had needed him most. Instead, he only said that the man who had destroyed him 3 years earlier was about to pay, that he needed Eddie to help with one thing. He needed him to tell everything he knew, everything he had witnessed, because the testimony of someone who had once been a victim could become an important link in bringing down that entire machine. After listening, Eddie nodded at once, without hesitation, without bargaining, and he looked straight into Salvatore's eyes, a rare thing for a man used to lowering his head. Then he said in a voice unexpectedly firm that he would do whatever was necessary, that he had been waiting for a chance like this for 3 long years. And he added one more sentence that Salvatore did not fully understand at the time, a sentence that sounded somewhat strange, that if the day ever came when the boss truly needed him, Eddie would repay this debt, even if the boss did not see him doing it. Salvatore only nodded, not thinking too deeply about those words, and the two men stood in silence beside each other for a while among the towering stacks of containers. Two people treated in different ways by the cruel machinery of the world, yet finally standing on the same side, while in the distance the November sun slowly sank behind the giant cranes, staining the river into a strip of cold silver. Late that afternoon, Ruth Adler came to the apartment on Taylor Street, carrying a box of hot food and the calmness Salvatore had arranged for her to be able to visit safely, because he understood that the woman hiding there needed a familiar face more than she needed a powerful stranger. And when Ruth sat down beside Delia on the sofa, the young woman finally began to speak, the words coming slowly at first and then faster, like a dam that had just opened through one small crack. Delia said she had once tried to do the right thing, that 2 years earlier, before she had dared to run, she had gathered all her courage and gone to another police station, in another district, and reported everything. She had shown them the bruises. She had told them each thing one by one, and for one brief moment, she had believed the system would protect her, that justice was real. But then she told the next part in a voice that had gone empty, that only 3 days later, her report disappeared from the system as though it had never existed, that the officer who had taken her statement was suddenly transferred somewhere else, and that on that night, when she came home, he was already waiting there, holding the very copy of the complaint she had signed, projecting a terrifyingly smug composure, and telling her in his sweetest voice that she should understand there was nowhere she could run where he couldn't reach her, because he was the system. Delia said that on that very night she understood a cruel truth, that when the person hunting you is part of the very machine that is supposed to protect you, every door you knock on only leads back to his hand. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Delia finished, the 58-year-old woman sat still for a long while. Then she took the young woman's trembling hand in her own calloused ones and began telling a story she had not told many people. She said that the little Meridian diner by the highway wasn't only an overnight diner, that for the past 20 years it had quietly been a stopping place, an unnamed, unsigned shelter for women running from men who claimed to love them, that there had been dozens of women like Delia crawling down to hide beneath that counter over the years, and that Ruth had learned how to shield them, how to lie calmly, how to recognize fear on a face in half a second, not because she had been born knowing how, but because she had been forced to learn. Then Ruth told her why, and her voice sank lower, saying that many years ago she had had a younger sister, a gentle and tender woman who fell into the hands of a man just like the one now hunting Delia. And when her sister went to people for help, no one believed her, no one reached out to help. Everyone turned away and told themselves it was a private matter in someone else's family, until one day it was too late, and Ruth lost her sister forever. She did not tell the details. She didn't need to. The silence after her words was heavier than any description could have been, and she said that from that day on, she had promised herself that, as long as she was still standing behind that counter, no woman would ever again have to cry out in despair without someone reaching a hand toward her. Delia listened to that story with tears silently running down her face, the first she had allowed to fall in many days, not for herself but for Ruth, and in that moment, the two women sat holding each other's hands in the quiet apartment, bound together by the same kind of wound stretching across generations. Salvatore stood silently by the doorway, having heard everything, and when he turned away to give the two women privacy, a cold truth crystallized in his mind, that in this world, clean paperwork always defeated dirty truth, that a file stamped with official seals always carried more weight than the words of a bleeding human being, because the system only believed what could be placed inside a filing cabinet, and fear was not a form that could be filled out and submitted in 3 copies. And with that thought, something else rose from the deepest part of his memory, not an image, only bare facts he had tried to bury for 12 years. That there had once been someone who wanted to testify, someone who had decided to tell the truth despite every danger, and that there had once been a council, a group of men sitting in the dark, who met to decide that person's fate, and he, Salvatore Barone, had sat in that room and said not a single word. That night, after Ruth had gone home, and the apartment on Taylor Street had sunk into the kind of stillness where only the steady patter of rain could be heard outside the window, Delia sat for a very long time on the edge of the sofa, the worn cloth bag resting in her lap, and Salvatore noticed that something was happening inside her, a silent struggle he did not rush. He only sat at his familiar distance beside the small table, patient in the way of a man who understood that trust wasn't something one could demand, but only something one could wait to be given. She had watched him over the past 2 days, had seen him pour her a cup of coffee without asking for anything in return, had seen him bring her to a safe place, and then step back to keep his distance, had seen him tell her the truth about the man hunting her, searching the city, instead of soothing her with comfortable lies, and had heard Ruth speak of the man who had quietly stood up to protect the vulnerable without needing anyone to know. All of that was not enough to erase 4 years of fear, but perhaps it was enough for her to take one more risk, to place her final wager on the goodness of another human being, after the world had taught her that kindness always came with a price. At last she opened the cloth bag, and from the bottom, beneath the small wool socks he had not noticed before, and the few belongings of a life spent running, she took out a tiny object wrapped in many layers of fabric, and when she unfolded the last layer, in her trembling palm lay an old black USB drive, its edges warped from being held too many times during the nights when she sat wondering whether it would save her or kill her. She held it out to him, and Salvatore looked into her eyes before looking at the object in her hand, because he understood that what she was giving him was not simply a storage device, but her entire survival over all these years, her last card, the only thing that had kept her alive, because the man hunting her knew that as long as it existed, he could not finish her off. She said in a small shaking voice that inside it was everything she had quietly collected through 2 years of living with him, the files she had secretly copied during the nights when he slept, fragments of conversations she had heard through the wall, numbers she had memorized and then written down, a list of people his network had destroyed, enormous sums of money that had passed through filthy hands, and the names of officials, people sitting in positions where they should have protected citizens, but instead had taken money to close their eyes and look away. Salvatore took the USB drive from her hand, and in the moment their fingers lightly touched, he felt the weight of the trust that had just been given to him. An invisible weight he knew he was not allowed to drop, and he told her, his voice low and steady, that he understood what she had just placed in his hands, and that he would not allow it, or her, to be harmed. Delia nodded, but then she hesitated, and before he could put the USB drive away, she added one more sentence in a voice so low it was almost only breath, that this was only one half. Salvatore lifted his eyes to her, and in her gaze there was something he had never seen in the timid woman, who so often lowered her head, a sharp glint, a calculation carefully hidden beneath the trembling surface. And he understood at once that she was not nearly as naive as she appeared, that through those years of running, she had learned how to protect herself in ways clever enough that even the man hunting her had not fully anticipated them. He did not ask where the other half was, did not press, did not interrogate her, because he understood that keeping one part of the secret for herself was exactly what had helped her survive until now, and forcing her to reveal it would only be another way of stripping away the fragile control she had only just begun to reclaim. He only nodded, tucked the USB drive securely into the inside pocket of his coat, and remembered that sentence, one half, carving it into his mind as a fact that might someday become a matter of life and death. Then he looked at her and said that she was far braver than she believed, and Delia, who had gone far too long without hearing a kind word about herself, turned her face away to hide the tears, suddenly blurring her eyes in the darkness of the room. When Salvatore put the USB drive away, and was about to stand so she could rest, his gaze accidentally passed over the cloth bag still lying half open in her lap, and he caught a glimpse of something small and ivory-colored at the bottom. Perhaps Delia noticed that look, because her hand stopped faintly at the mouth of the bag, hesitating, like someone standing before the threshold of a room she had locked shut for a very long time and wasn't sure she had the strength to open. Then, slowly, she reached into the bag and took the object out, lifting it in her palm beneath the sickly yellow light of the only lamp in the room, and Salvatore saw that it was a pair of tiny wool socks, so small they could fit entirely in one hand, knitted from ivory yarn that had yellowed with the years, one sock still intact, and the other worn at the heel from being held too many times. She held them so gently, as though she were afraid of hurting them, and she began to speak in a strangely even voice, the voice of someone recounting the greatest pain of her life with a frightening calm, because all the tears meant for it had run dry, long ago. She said the little girl would have been 4 years old by now, that she often still imagined what her face would have looked like, whose eyes she would have had, how her laughter would have sounded, where her first unsteady steps would have landed, and that she had kept these socks with her for the past 4 years, through 4 cities, through 3 false names, through every escape, only to remind herself that there had been one brief time when she had almost been a mother, when she had dared to dream of something tender in a life made only of fear. She said she had knitted these socks with her own trembling hands during the months of waiting, that she had hidden them away, because even that joy had to be hidden, and that on one winter night she lost her child. And that was all she said, one winter night. She lost her child, not one more word about how it had happened, and it was exactly that emptiness in the telling, the thing she did not say, that said everything, hanging in the room heavier than anything she could have put into words. Salvatore sat motionless, and he said nothing, offered no hollow comfort, gave no advice, did not try to heal or explain or soften what could not be softened, because he understood with the deep instinct of someone who had endured loss that there were kinds of pain, where the kindest thing one could do was not speak, but listen, stay, witness, allow a person to say what they had carried alone for far too long without fear of judgment, without fear of being interrupted, without fear of being pitied. He only sat there, his gray eyes never leaving her face. And in his silence there was a respect Delia had never received from anyone, a respect for her pain, as though it were something sacred rather than a burden. And perhaps that unconditional listening was the gift no man had ever given her in her entire life. She lifted her eyes to him, and there were no tears in them, only a tired emptiness that had become far too familiar. But there was something else too, a fragile relief belonging to someone who had just set down part of a burden she had believed she would have to carry alone until the end of her life. Salvatore finally spoke, but he did not speak about the baby, did not speak about the pain. He only said softly, in a low, hoarse voice, that she had kept them beautifully, those socks, and that she didn't have to put them away if she didn't want to, and the way he spoke of them is something worthy of honor, not something she had to feel ashamed of or hide, made Delia tighten her fingers around the wool socks and nod. And in the small, quiet apartment at the heart of the rain-soaked city, 2 people carrying 2 different wounds with the same shape, the wound of those who had lost someone they should have protected, sat beside each other in a silence that was no longer lonely. Salvatore was not the kind of man who displayed his strength, and that was precisely what made that strength frightening, because while other men resorted to bullets and loud shows of power, he needed only a phone and a few minutes. The next morning, from his office overlooking his river, he took out his phone, dialed a number, and when the other end picked up, he said only a few short sentences, his voice low and calm, without the slightest threat in his tone, because men in his position didn't need to threaten. They only needed to inform, and the listener would understand the rest on his own. He spoke the name Bradford Kessler, said he wanted to know who was backing him, who was keeping that umbrella of protection open over his head, and that he wanted that umbrella to start collapsing. Then he hung up, and the invisible machine began to turn. Not far away, in another part of the city, Bradford Kessler began to realize that something was wrong, though at first he couldn't name it. In the morning, he called an acquaintance in the records office, someone who had always been willing to make inconvenient documents disappear. But this time the man did not answer, and the second call was the same, then the third. He called a higher official, someone he had kept in his pocket with regular envelopes for many years, someone who always answered him on the first ring. But this time the phone rang and rang before falling into voicemail, once, twice, 3 times, and the silence at the other end began to echo in his ears like a death drum. By mid-afternoon, 2 colleagues who had often stood beside him in filthy dealings suddenly became strangely distant, one making the excuse that he was busy to avoid meeting him, the other speaking in a cautious voice, and saying that perhaps Kessler should handle his own business for a while. And Kessler, a man who had spent his entire career reading other people's fear, now recognized that very scent rising from those around him, the scent of rats streaming away from a ship they had sensed was about to sink. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't know what invisible hand was pulling one card after another out from beneath his feet, but he could feel it, the feeling of a man standing on a sheet of ice while cracks quietly spread beneath the soles of his shoes. And for the first time in many years, Bradford Kessler felt something he had grown used to forcing others to taste: helplessness. Meanwhile, in the office by the river, Salvatore's trusted man returned with what he had dug up, placing on the desk a new and more detailed chart that mapped out the entire chain of protection behind Kessler, link by link, from low-level officials who took a little money to close their eyes, up to people in positions that grew higher and higher, and Salvatore followed that chain with his eyes, step by step, until it led to the top, to one final link high above, and there, on the chart, was a blank space. He asked his man who the name at the highest position was, and that man, someone who had seen enough in life and rarely showed emotion, suddenly hesitated, his eyes sliding away, and he said in a lowered voice that he had traced the name, but that it was a name he did not want to speak aloud even inside this sealed room, a name large enough to make touching it a gamble very few people would dare to place. Salvatore looked at that blank space on the chart for a long while, his gaze narrowing as he leaned back into the shadows of his chair, and he understood that the machine he intended to confront reached far deeper and climbed far higher than one inspector who abused his ex-wife, that this was not the story of one solitary evil man, but the story of an entire system rotten from the roots, and he knew that to bring down something that large, he couldn't do it alone from the shadows. He would need someone on the other side, someone inside that very system who still had clean hands, someone he could trust, and in his mind, among countless faces from a life full of calculation, only one name appeared, a man he had helped many years earlier in a dark hour, a federal agent named Frank Delgado, and Salvatore knew that sooner or later he would have to pick up the phone and call that man, even if doing so meant throwing open the door into his own empire. In his dark apartment on an upper floor of a building overlooking the city, Bradford Kessler stood beside the window with a glass of liquor in his hand that he did not drink, and what gnawed at him from the inside that night wasn't only the feeling that he was being surrounded by some invisible force, but an older fear, a deeper fear, one that had haunted him for 4 long years, ever since the day he discovered that the woman he had believed was entirely under his control was not nearly as naive as he had always assumed. He remembered the night he had accidentally caught her quietly closing a notebook and hurriedly hiding it inside her shirt, remembered the look she had lifted toward him then, a look he had dismissed at the time as the usual panic of a weak person. But now, looking back, he understood that there had been something else in those eyes, a cold calculation he had been too arrogant to recognize. Throughout 2 years of living together, he had always seen her as a broken creature, a timid woman who only knew how to lower her head and tremble, someone easy to threaten and control, and that contempt had become the greatest mistake of his life, because he had never imagined that beneath that trembling shell was a mind quietly watching, remembering, and gathering. She had copied everything, he knew that. She had secretly collected evidence all through those years beside him, and what terrified him most, what made it impossible for him to sleep, was that he knew with certainty she had not kept only one copy. She had been clever enough to split that evidence in 2, one half carried with her as a shield for survival, and the other half, the half he had been hunting for in a frenzy all this time without finding, she had hidden. Through his underground connections, he had traced a clue that the other half was inside a safe deposit box at some bank, registered under a false name only she knew, one of the many names she had used during the years she spent running, and that meant as long as she was alive and free, that half of the evidence remained a ticking bomb hanging over his head, something that could explode at any moment and sweep away everything he had built. That was why finding her had become so urgent, not because of love or possession as he kept claiming, but because she was the only living threat he couldn't control. And he understood that if she fell into the right hands, if she found someone strong enough and brave enough to stand on her side, then the 2 halves of the evidence would be joined together, and by then no badge, no connection, could save him. That realization made his hand tighten around the glass until his knuckles turned white, and the calm mask he had always worn before the world began to crack in the loneliness of the room. His jaw clenched, a vein pulsing at his temple, the perfect appearance of a respected inspector falling apart to reveal the panicked animal beneath. He knew he could no longer handle this by himself, that he needed a colder mind, a more skillful hand at arranging filthy situations. And so he set the glass down, took out his phone, and dialed a number he used only in the worst circumstances. At the other end, after a few rings, a woman's voice rose, composed, sharp and cold, without the slightest sleepiness. Though it was already past midnight, the voice of someone accustomed to staying awake, to clean up the messes other people created, and it was the voice of Corinne Fielding, the lawyer whom people in his circles quietly called the Fixer, a woman capable of turning scandals into dust and making inconvenient truths disappear inside the maze of the law. Kessler told her about Delia, about the two halves of the evidence, about the fact that she had found protection from someone whose identity he had not yet confirmed, but whose power he could feel. And at the other end of the line, Corinne listened in silence for a long while. Then she said, in her frighteningly even voice, that she would personally come to the city, that some accidents had to be handled by her own hand. The gleaming black Bentley pulled to the curb in front of Salvatore's office building at twilight the next day, a luxurious machine, strangely out of place amid the rough industrial harbor district. From the back seat stepped a woman around 50 years old, in a perfectly tailored steel gray outfit, her hair pinned into a neat bun without a single strand out of place, walking on high heels with the confidence of someone who had never had to wait for anyone. Corinne Fielding did not need to announce herself, did not need an appointment. She simply walked straight into the building with the bearing of someone who knew she would be received. And sure enough, when Salvatore's men reported that a special visitor had arrived, he signaled for them to bring her in, because he recognized that name at once, a name from a past he had tried to leave behind. Corinne Fielding was no stranger to Salvatore. They had once existed in the same dark ecosystem many years earlier, before he had begun cleansing his empire, and she was one of the few people who knew the shadowed corners of his history, who knew the filthy foundations from which he had built the respectable face he now showed the world. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited, placed her leather briefcase on her lap, and smiled a smile as thin as a blade. Then she said it had been a long time since they had seen each other, that she was very pleased to see how far he had come on his path toward becoming a respectable citizen, a philanthropist, a real estate magnate, a patron of community funds. The way she listed his achievements did not sound like praise, but like a threat, each word spoken like a brick being set down to build the wall she was about to press him against. And Salvatore sat still and listened, his face motionless, understanding that this woman had not come here to reminisce. Then Corinne opened the leather briefcase, took out a stack of documents, and slid it across the desk toward him. And when Salvatore glanced down, he recognized at once what it was. It was a detailed record of his empire, not the clean part he displayed to the world, but the hidden veins underneath, old transactions, names, connections, any portion of which, if brought into the light, would be enough to burn down everything he had labored to build over the past 12 years. She said in an even voice, almost gentle, that she knew he was sheltering a woman, that she knew he intended to move against Bradford Kessler, and that she had come here to advise him, as one old acquaintance advising another, to think very carefully about the price. She said that if he touched Kessler, he would not fall alone. He would drag an entire federal investigation down with him. And once the federal authorities began digging, they would not stop at Kessler. They would dig through everything, dig all the way down to the foundations he had buried. And the 12 years he had spent working to redeem the past, to become someone else, would all turn to ash in the blink of an eye. She said he had a very simple choice. All he had to do was step back, let go of that woman, and turn away as though none of this had ever happened, and his empire would remain intact, his new life would be preserved, and no one would have to know what lay underneath. Salvatore sat silently, his hands resting flat against the mahogany desk as he absorbed the gravity of the threat. And he understood that this was a trap set with perfect care, a cruel choice between a strange woman and everything he had lived for during the past 12 years. Corinne stood, closed the briefcase, and had nearly reached the door when she stopped. And there was something in the way she hesitated that made Salvatore look up, because hesitation was not something often seen in this woman. She was not entirely certain of her next move, not certain how much he knew, not certain whether the card she was considering should be turned over now, or held back as a final blow. And in the end she chose to release only one sentence, a probing remark disguised as a careless slip, as she turned back to look at him with eyes sharp as a scalpel. She said that he thought he had lost everything, didn't he? That he had punished himself for so many years over a loss he believed could never be undone. But perhaps he should ask himself again whether he had truly lost the thing he had always been so certain was gone. Then she smiled once more, that thin and mysterious smile, and walked out of the room, leaving Salvatore sitting alone in the fading evening light, her words hanging in the air like a poisoned seed just planted, a riddle he could not solve. A vague crack opened in the 12-year wall he had believed was sealed shut, and though he did not understand what she was trying to imply, a cold unease began to creep through his chest, the feeling of a man who had just been reminded that perhaps he had never known the whole truth. Corinne's words clung to Salvatore all through that night, and as he sat alone in the darkness of his office with the city lights casting shifting streaks across the ceiling, they dragged him back to the place he had spent 12 years avoiding, to the night he had never told anyone about and had never stopped carrying. 12 years earlier, when Salvatore was still rising within the family, still hungry for the power he now despised, he had a younger brother named Tommaso, 2 years younger than him, a young man with bright eyes and a heart far too soft for the world into which they had both been born. Tommaso had never belonged to that world. He loathed it, and in the fall of that year, he made a decision so bold and dangerous there could be no turning back. He decided he would leave the family, would testify before the law about everything he knew, would trade his own safety to drag into the light the darkness his family had lived inside for generations. In those final days, Tommaso came to Salvatore, the older brother he trusted more than anyone else in the world, and sent him a message asking to meet late one night at a small shabby diner beside the highway. The diner called Meridian, a neutral and discreet place where he hoped he could tell his brother about his plan, could beg him to come with him, or at least beg him not to stop him, not to betray him. He had sat there waiting in that diner all night, beside a cup of coffee slowly going cold, his eyes fixed on the rain-wet glass door, watching every sweep of headlights passing along the highway, and hoping each one would be the car bringing his brother to him. But Salvatore had not come. He had received that message, had read it, had sat for a long time with the phone in his hand, torn between blood and ambition, between protecting his only younger brother and preserving the position he had sacrificed so much to obtain. And in the end, in the greatest cowardice of his life, he had chosen silence. He had not answered the message. He had not come. He had left his younger brother sitting alone in that cold diner until dawn began to break, and Tommaso finally understood that the brother he loved most would not come, that he would have to face the road ahead entirely alone. Only a few days later, word spread through the underworld that Tommaso had disappeared, that the council, that group of powerful men sitting in the dark and deciding the fate of those who dared betray them, had dealt with him, and everyone, Salvatore included, believed that his brother had been eliminated, that Tommaso had paid with his life for the intention to betray them. There was no body, no funeral, only a heavy silence and an unspoken warning sent to anyone who still considered leaving the family. Salvatore had believed that for 12 years, had lived with the belief that his silence, that the night he did not come, had pushed his innocent brother to his death, and that guilt had become a smoldering fire burning him from within, driving him to gradually abandon the old path, to build a clean empire as a way of atoning for a death he believed he had caused. What he did not know, what no one in the underworld knew, was that the council had never truly acted, that just before they could, federal agents had reached Tommaso, had placed him in the witness protection program, had given him a new name, a new life, a refuge thousands of miles away, and that the rumor of his execution had only been a staged performance, partly spread by the council itself to hide the humiliation that its prey had slipped through its fingers, and partly left to circulate quietly by the federal authorities, because a witness believed to be dead would be far safer than a witness known to be alive. And so for 12 years, Tommaso had still been alive somewhere, under some name, while his older brother nailed himself to the cross of a guilt that had never truly happened. And now, sitting alone in the darkness, with Corinne's mysterious words echoing in his head, Salvatore could not know that the truth he had buried for all those years had not been the truth after all, that the thing he had always believed lost might still be breathing somewhere beneath this sky. Dawn arrived late and gray the next morning, and Salvatore was still sitting exactly where he had sat all night, beside the office window overlooking the river as it slowly shifted from black to lead, and before him, on the dark wooden desk, lay two things placed beside each other, like the two ends of a scale. On one side was the stack of documents Corinne had left behind, the papers containing the entire fate of his empire, and on the other was the small worn USB drive Delia had placed in his hand, the object containing the entire survival of a strange woman. He looked at those two things for a long while, and he understood that this was not simply a strategic decision, but a judgment of the man he was, a test fate had set before him with a cruelty so sharp it almost felt mocking, because it was exactly the same, terrifyingly the same, as the situation he had faced 12 years ago, when another human being had needed him, and he had chosen silence to preserve his position. Back then, he had placed his chair above his own blood, had let ambition silence conscience, and he had paid for that choice with 12 years of relentless torment. And now fate had placed him at that same crossroads once more. On one side, everything he had built in an attempt to atone. On the other, a human being who needed him not to turn away. And the question hanging in the cold room was not what he would choose, but what kind of man he had become after all these years. He thought of Delia, of her exhausted, wary eyes, of the tiny wool socks she kept like a broken piece of a stolen dream, of the way she had risked placing the last of her trust in his hands after the whole world had taught her that trust was a deadly luxury. He thought of Eddie Vance, of the bent back and calloused hands, of 3 years of a life crushed right under his nose while he looked in another direction. And he thought of Tommaso, of the diner beside the highway, of all the nights he had returned there, month after month for so many years, to sit at that very table, like a silent ritual of self-punishment, to remember the younger brother he believed had died because of his cowardice. Then he stood, walked to the window, and said softly, almost to himself, that he had once betrayed a person through his silence, that this empire, this respectable life, all of it had been raised from the foundation of that silence, built with the bricks of a sin he had never dared to name, and that if keeping it meant he had to remain silent one more time, had to turn away from a human being crying out for help, then that empire was not worth keeping. And if everything had to be burned down so he would never have to remain silent again, then let it burn. Once that decision was spoken aloud, it lifted from his shoulders a burden he had carried. For so long he had forgotten he was still carrying it, and with the calmness of a man who had finally chosen the right side of himself, he took out his phone and dialed a number he had kept for many years but had never once called. At the other end, after a few rings, a man's deep and alert voice answered, and Salvatore said his own name, only 2 words, and he felt the stunned silence on the other end, because Frank Delgado, the federal agent whom Salvatore had quietly helped many years before in a dark hour of his life, had never thought the day would come when he would receive this call. Salvatore spoke plainly, without circling around the truth, saying that he had evidence in his hands that could expose an entire network of extortion and false charges rooted deep inside the police force and among public officials, that he was willing to hand over everything. But he also made clear what he knew would come, that once Frank began pulling this thread, the investigation would not stop with those men and would very likely lead back to Salvatore himself, to his own empire, and he accepted that. Frank was silent for a while, then asked cautiously why a man like Salvatore would voluntarily put his own head in a noose. And Salvatore only answered quietly that there were some debts a man could not keep running from forever, and that this time he would stand his ground and face the storm. Salvatore's men had been watching Bradford Kessler's every move for 2 days, and so when he left his apartment close to midnight, got into the dark sedan, and drove straight toward Rockwell Harbor. The news was immediately reported back to Salvatore, who understood at once what that move meant. Kessler's racing against time. He could feel the machine tightening around him, and he knew that if the investigation truly began, the first thing that could bury him would be the original files, the physical documents he had hidden for years inside an abandoned warehouse at the far corner of the harbor. Black and white proof of every frame job, every payment, every name, the thing he had kept as insurance to control his accomplices, but which had now become a noose around his own neck. He had to destroy them, and he had to do it tonight. Rockwell Harbor at night was a massive maze of towering container stacks, giant cranes standing like black silhouettes against the sky, and old sheet metal warehouses scattered along the water's edge. Everything sunk into a heavy silence broken only by the lazy slap of water against concrete pilings, and the distant screech of metal somewhere in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of sea salt mixed with engine oil and rust, the particular smell of a place where people came to do things they did not want anyone to see. Kessler parked his car some distance from the warehouse, turned off the lights, and walked through the darkness with a small flashlight and a fuel can, certain that at this hour, in this deserted place, no one would witness what he was about to do. What he did not know was that Salvatore's network had quietly moved one step ahead of him, had discreetly sent the night guards elsewhere, with carefully arranged excuses, had cleared the area of every possible witness, not to help him destroy the evidence, but to create a closed stage, a controlled space where Salvatore could face him without outside interference, while at the same time every exit from the warehouse area had been silently covered by Salvatore's men, so that once Kessler stepped inside, he would have no way back. Salvatore arrived with a small group of his most trusted men, and among those meant to accompany him that night, according to the plan, was Eddie Vance. Because Eddie's testimony, the presence of a living, breathing victim, was an important link Salvatore wanted there to confront the man who had destroyed him. But when the group gathered in the darkness at the edge of the warehouse district, preparing to move in on the target, Salvatore looked around and realized Eddie was not there. The bent-backed man, the one who had been with them only minutes earlier, had vanished without a trace, as though the darkness of the harbor had swallowed him whole. Salvatore signaled for his men to search quickly and quietly, but no one saw any sign of Eddie. Not a sound, not a trace, only the thick silence of the stacked containers, and the wind hissing through the metal gaps. A cold worry began to tighten around Salvatore's chest, because he knew exactly what kind of man Kessler was, knew exactly what he had done to people who stood in his way, and the first thought that rushed into his mind, the darkest thought, was that Kessler had somehow discovered Eddie, had dealt with the man in the darkness before they could react, that once again, someone Salvatore had a responsibility to protect was about to pay, because he had not been fast enough, not careful enough. That fear, that echo of an old guilt, made the blood in his body seem to freeze, and for one moment he stood motionless in the harbor darkness, torn between the mission to close in on Kessler and the urge to search for Eddie. But time did not allow him to hesitate, because ahead of them, through the crack of the half-open warehouse door, the flickering light of a flashlight had begun sweeping back and forth, and the smell of fuel had started to drift into the air, a sign that Kessler had begun the work of destroying his evidence, and Salvatore understood that if he did not act right now, all the original proof would turn to ash within minutes. He forced down his worry for Eddie, clenched his jaw, and signaled for his men to close the circle. Moving toward the warehouse door, where the man with the badge was bent beneath the wavering light, completely unaware that his path of retreat had been cut off, and that this dark stage had not been prepared for his destruction of evidence, but for his own downfall. Salvatore pushed open the warehouse door and stepped inside, and Bradford Kessler sprang up from where he had been bent over the pile of files, the flashlight in his hand wobbling as it swept a panic streak of light across the rusted sheet metal walls, before stopping on the face of the man who had just appeared in the doorway. For an instant, shock showed plainly on his face, because he had been certain no one knew he was here, certain this deserted place at this hour was completely safe for what he intended to do, and the realization that he had been followed, that this dark stage had been prepared for him, twisted his face with a panic he could not hide in time. Salvatore stepped forward, his voice low and terrifyingly calm, and told Kessler that it was over, that the files he was trying to burn would no longer save him, that the two halves of the evidence were about to be joined, and that the network he had leaned on was beginning to fall apart piece by piece. But even as he said it, another fear was still churning in his chest, because Eddie Vance was still nowhere to be found. and he could not drive away the dark image of the worst thing that might have happened, until from the shadows behind the towering file shelves in the far corner of the warehouse, a voice rose, low and firm, and Eddie Vance stepped out of the darkness. The bent-backed man had not been harmed, had not been attacked by Kessler, as Salvatore had feared. Instead, it turned out he had quietly separated from the group and gone one step ahead, had slipped into the warehouse through a side entrance only long-time harbor workers knew about, had silently held the one remaining escape door to make sure Kessler could not run. And more important than anything else, during all the time he had been hidden in the dark, he had secretly turned on a small recording device concealed in his coat pocket, capturing every word Kessler had just spoken, every accidental admission about the files, about destroying them, enough to become the final legal piece that tightened the net around him. That was the debt Eddie had promised to repay, even if no one saw him doing it. And the man who had spent his life used to lowering his head, the man the world had crushed and cast aside, turned out to be the one who had quietly taken the initiative to save the entire group with the very silence others had mistaken for weakness. Kessler looked at Eddie, recognized the face of the man he had destroyed 3 years earlier, and something inside him broke apart, the last calm mask falling away to reveal the animal cornered against the wall. And in that desperation, he did what men like him always did when all their cards had been turned over. He thrust his hand inside his coat and pulled out a gun, raised it, and aimed it straight at Salvatore, his hand shaking with panic, his eyes wild with the gaze of a man who had nothing left to lose. The air in the warehouse froze. Salvatore's men stopped in the middle of their movements, and in that moment suspended between life and death, something no one expected happened. From the warehouse door, where she should not have been, where Salvatore had told her to remain somewhere safe, but she had quietly followed because she could no longer bear sitting still in the dark. While her fate was decided by other people, Delia stepped inside, and she did not crouch down, did not shrink back, did not look for a place to hide the way the reflex of 4 years had taught her. She did the opposite of everything fear had taught her. She walked straight forward, placed her own body between the mouth of the gun and the man who had not turned away from her. And for the first time since Salvatore had met her, for the first time, after all those years of lowering her face to the ground, she lifted her head high. Kessler stared wide-eyed at the woman he had controlled, threatened and hunted, now standing upright before him with a presence he had never seen in her, and for one instant, the hand holding the gun wavered from that absolute shock. Delia looked straight into his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer the trembling whisper of the woman hiding beneath the counter, but clear and steady, ringing against the sheet metal walls of the warehouse. She told him she had been silent for 4 long years, that she had lived 4 years in fear, lowering her head, making herself small, telling herself that if she was obedient enough, quiet enough, the storm would pass. But now she understood, and she would not be silent for 1 more second. Those words, spoken by the woman he had always considered the weakest of all, struck Kessler harder than any fist could have done, and he froze, his whole body paralyzed for one confused and bewildered moment. The precious moment created by the extraordinary courage of the person who had seemed most powerless. And it was in that very moment, when all his attention was pulled toward the woman standing with her head raised before him, that Salvatore got the opening he needed. In the moment Kessler froze, his eyes and the barrel of his gun both drawn toward the woman, standing upright before him. Salvatore lunged forward, and with the speed of a man who had spent his whole life in situations where a single delayed heartbeat meant death. He needed only a few decisive movements to lock down the arm holding the gun, twist it off course, and strip the weapon from Kessler's trembling hand. The struggle was brief and clean, not prolonged, not bloody, only the disciplined strength of a man who knew exactly what he was doing overwhelming, the clumsy panic of someone who had lost all composure. And within a few seconds, Bradford Kessler had been pinned. The gun was in Salvatore's hand, and his men immediately closed in, holding the man with the badge so tightly that he could not move. Salvatore straightened, breathing evenly, and he looked down at the man now completely subdued, the man who had destroyed Eddie Vance. The man who had tormented Delia for 4 years, the man who had used his badge and his warm smile to sow suffering over so many people in the dark, and for one moment, the old part of Salvatore, The part that had grown up in a world where blood debts were paid in blood, rose inside him with all its force. He held the gun in his hand, and he knew how easy it would be, knew that with one action, in a single instant, he could end this threat forever, could avenge Eddie, Delia, and all the nameless victims, could do the thing every fiber of his old self was screaming for him to do. Kessler felt it too. He looked up into Salvatore's stone-cold face, and pure terror flashed in his eyes, the terror of a man who knew he was standing at the edge of the abyss, and perhaps he truly believed this was the final moment of his life. But Salvatore did not pull the trigger. He stood there for a long time, the gun heavy in his hand, and in the tense silence of the warehouse, another battle was taking place, not between him and Kessler, but between him and himself, between the man he had once been and the man he was trying to become. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun, removed the magazine with a practiced motion, and handed it to one of his men. He bent close to Kessler, and when he spoke, his voice was low and clear, without a trace of anger, only a cold certainty more frightening than any rage. He told him that if he killed him now, Kessler would become a victim, that people would mourn a respected inspector murdered by a criminal. The story would be twisted, the truth would be buried along with his body, and all the people he had destroyed would never be cleared. He said death would be far too easy an escape, far too merciful for a man like him, a release he did not deserve. No, he said, he wanted him to live a long time, to stand before the court, to hear every charge read aloud, to witness each victim he had tormented step into the light and point straight at his face, to live so this entire city, the city that had once respected him, that had once given him medals, could see the true face hidden behind that badge and that warm smile. That, he said, was real justice, not a bullet in the dark, but the truth exposed beneath daylight, and that was what Kessler would have to face. When Salvatore straightened and turned his back on the man he had subdued, he felt something shift deep inside him. Because in the moment he chose not to pull the trigger, he had not merely spared the life of a man he despised. He had stepped across a threshold he had never dared cross before, had chosen justice over revenge, had chosen light over darkness, and in that choice the man who had once been an underworld boss became something else. Something that 12 years of atonement had still not been able to make him, until this very moment. The red and blue lights of the federal vehicles tore through the darkness of Rockwell Harbor, less than an hour later, and Frank Delgado stepped out of the lead car, a man around 45 years old with a severe face, and the eyes of someone who had spent his whole career looking at the worst things human beings could do to one another. He had come as soon as he received Salvatore's call, bringing with him a team of agents he trusted absolutely, people outside the local network that might already have been bought. And now, beneath the cold glare of headlights, the pieces of a picture that had been hidden for so many years were finally being placed side by side. The USB drive Delia had given Salvatore provided the list of victims, the money, the names, but that was only one half, and now, as Delia stood beneath the lights with the new calm of someone who had just found her voice again, she told Frank about the other half, about the safe deposit box in a bank, registered under a false name only she knew, and she agreed to open it, voluntarily handing over the final piece she had kept for so many years as her shield for survival. Alongside those two halves of evidence were the original files Kessler had tried to burn inside the warehouse, now seized intact, and above all, the recording Eddie Vance had quietly captured in the darkness, preserving Kessler's own voice admitting to the destruction of evidence, an undeniable self-incriminating confession. Piece by piece, everything fit together, layered upon itself, until the entire network emerged clearly beneath the light, a web of extortion and false charges rooted deep inside the police force and reaching upward into the higher levels of power. But when Frank followed that chain of protection to the top, to the highest link that even Salvatore's own man had once hesitated to speak aloud, his face went pale, because the name appearing there was not a stranger, but Frank's direct superior at the regional office, the man he had reported to for years, the man he now understood was the reason every file, every accusation against Kessler in the past had quietly disappeared, buried before it could ever reach the desks of people who might have acted. Frank stood still beneath the lights, and Salvatore saw in him the same struggle he himself had gone through only hours before, because Frank understood that if he pulled this thread all the way to the end, he would not only bring down one corrupt inspector, but would have to turn the blade toward his own superior, would have to betray the very system that had raised his career, would place his entire future, and perhaps even his safety in danger. It was a choice between career and justice, strangely parallel to the choice Salvatore had faced between empire and conscience. And, for one long moment, two men from opposing worlds looked at each other across the cold harbor yard, understanding each other in the way only people who had just paid a heavy price for doing the right thing could understand. Then Frank nodded, a slow and decisive nod, and ordered his people to proceed, accepting the price, choosing the harder road. Bradford Kessler was escorted out of the warehouse in handcuffs, and this time there was no practiced smile left on his face, only the mute emptiness of a man who had understood that everything was over. That same night, at a luxury hotel where she had been waiting for the outcome of the moves she had arranged, Corinne Fielding also heard federal agents knock at her door. And when they presented the arrest warrant, she did not panic, did not beg or deny anything, but only closed the notebook she had been writing in, stood, adjusted the front of her outfit with frightening composure, and smiled her thin blade-like smile, because even in the moment of arrest, her cold mind was still running, still calculating, still searching for a gap, a clause, a weakness in the chain of evidence she could exploit, and she left the room with the stride of someone who believed the real legal war had only just begun. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of investigations, long testimony sessions and soulless rooms under fluorescent lights, where the truth was peeled back layer by layer. And Salvatore Baroni kept his promise in a way very few men from his world had ever dared to do. He walked into those rooms not as a man cornered, but as a volunteer, handing over every piece of evidence he possessed, answering every question, and making no attempt to hide his own role in the larger picture. The federal prosecutors, faced with a figure they had watched from a distance for many years, but had never been able to touch, were suspicious of his cooperation at first, waiting for a trap, some hidden scheme, but little by little they realized that this man was truly doing what his words claimed. And in the end, an agreement was placed on the table, a conditional immunity deal, not a clean ticket out of guilt, but an exchange that carried its own price. Salvatore would not face the heaviest sentences his past could have brought down on him, but in return he would have to dismantle every illegal part of his empire, surrender the underground networks, the dirty transactions, the dark foundations from which he had risen, and cooperate fully with the investigation now spreading like an oil stain through the layers of the system. He accepted all of it without bargaining, because he understood that this was the true price of redemption, not one glittering heroic act on a rainy night, but the slow and painful surrender of everything he had spent his life building and holding, the dismantling of the very power that had defined him for so many years. The man whose name had once made an entire city hold its breath was now taking apart his own empire brick by brick with his own hands, and in that loss, strangely enough, he found a lightness power had never given him. One late afternoon, after a long session, Frank Delgado found Salvatore in a quiet corner outside the federal building, and the agent stood silently for a while before speaking of something he had uncovered during the investigation, a detail that did not belong in any case file but had troubled him. He said he had investigated the history of the little diner by the highway, the Meridian Diner, where all of this had begun, and that he now truly understood why Salvatore had returned there once every month for the past 12 years, sitting at the exact same table in the corner. Frank said that, looking at the old records of that fateful night, he finally recognized the depth of the guilt Salvatore had been carrying, knowing that it was the very place where Tommaso had waited for a brother who never came. Salvatore stood still as he listened to those words, the silent torment he had carried for so many years, his mute ritual of self-punishment, was not being revealed to him, but validated by another person who finally saw his pain. In that moment, he felt a strange nakedness, as though the most hidden part of his soul had just been exposed to the light, but with it came a deep relief. Because a burden recognized by an ally is always lighter than one carried in absolute isolation. Not far from where the two men stood, in another testimony room, Delia Warren was sitting before federal agents as well, telling her story, detail by detail, the years of fear, the evidence she had quietly collected, the times she had tried to ask for help and been buried by the system, and the greatest difference, the thing even she noticed as the words came out, was that she no longer lowered her face to the table when she spoke. For the first time in so many years, she sat with her back straight, her head raised, and looked directly into the eyes of the people listening to her, not with the wariness of prey, but with the dignity of a human being reclaiming her own voice and her own truth. And in that simple posture, the posture of a woman who finally dared to lift her head, there was a quiet rebirth that no sentence could grant and no one could ever take from her again. Many days later, when the investigation had begun following each branch of the enormous network that the evidence had exposed, Frank Delgado came to Salvatore again, but this time his face carried a different expression, a caution mixed with something almost gentle, the look of a man about to say something that could either collapse or rebuild an entire world inside the person listening. He said that while digging through old files connected to this network, he had unexpectedly touched sealed documents from 12 years earlier, records belonging to a witness protection program. He never should have been allowed to access if not for the special authority granted by the current investigation. And among the names inside, he had found one that made him go still when he compared it with what he knew about Salvatore, Tommaso Barone. Frank spoke that name slowly, and he looked straight into Salvatore's eyes as he said that his younger brother had never died, that the rumor of his being eliminated 12 years earlier had only been staged, that just before the council could act, federal agents had reached Tommaso, had placed him in the witness protection program, had given him a new name and a new life, somewhere thousands of miles away, and that for the past 12 years, while Salvatore had nailed himself to the cross of a death he believed he had caused, his brother had still been alive, still breathing, still walking beneath the same sky. Salvatore stood frozen, and the entire world around him seemed to stop, because the truth that had just been spoken was too vast for his mind to hold in a single moment. 12 years of torment, over a decade of carrying a crushing remorse, 12 years of raising an empire like a gravestone for someone who had never been laid to rest. All of it suddenly swayed beneath the weight of something he had never dared to hope for. And along with that shock, another piece suddenly clicked into place in his mind. Corinne's mysterious words in his office that afternoon, that he thought he had lost everything, but perhaps he had not truly lost the thing he had always been so certain was gone, and now he understood that the cold woman had known. She had known Tommaso was alive, and she had kept that truth as a reserve card, a final lever she intended to use if the threat against his empire was not enough to make him step back, and that realization chilled his blood, because he understood that on the night he chose not to turn away from Delia, the night he decided to confront the entire machine instead of walking away as Corinne had tempted him to do, he had nearly sacrificed even the chance to know that his brother was still alive, and that fate had hung the greatest reward of his life right beside the hardest choice, only allowing it to be revealed once he chose correctly. Frank handed him an envelope yellowed by the years, and he said this had been kept in Tommaso's file for 12 years, a letter his brother had written in the final days before disappearing, a letter addressed to his older brother but never sent, perhaps because Tommaso understood that sending it would have been too dangerous for them both. Salvatore took the letter with hands that trembled faintly, opened it beneath the light, and recognized his brother's handwriting at once, that slanted hand he had not seen in 12 years, and he read. Tommaso wrote that if Salvatore was reading these lines, it meant he had had to go very far away, to a place where perhaps they would never see each other again, and he wrote that he did not blame him, that he understood why he had not come that night, understood the fear and the conflict that had bound him, and that he asked only one thing of him, that he never try to atone for him by building anything more, never raise empires or monuments or legacies to fill the space he had left behind, because all of those things were meaningless, and that if Salvatore truly wanted to do something for him, then there was only one thing: never be silent again, never turn away when a human being needed him to speak. Salvatore read those lines, and for the first time in many years, the man an entire city had once feared began to weep, silent tears running down a face scarred by time and guilt, because he recognized a coincidence so suffocating it was almost impossible to breathe, that the Meridian Diner where 12 years earlier he had remained silent against his brother's final wish was the very place where only recently he had chosen not to remain silent for a strange woman hiding beneath the counter, that the circle had closed in a way so complete it felt almost like fate, and that although the burden of 12 years did not vanish from his shoulders, it had shifted, had changed its shape, from a stone of guilt into something lighter, something close to forgiveness, which at last he could begin learning how to give himself. When the legal storms finally quieted and Delia Warren was truly free, for the first time in so many years, she made a decision some people perhaps did not expect. She chose to leave. She did not stay beside Salvatore, did not turn herself into a reward for the man who had saved her, because she understood, and so did he, that what she needed most now was not another man to lean on, no matter how good he might be, but the chance to finally stand steady on her own feet, to build a life that belonged to her and to no one else. She chose Portland, a distant city on the West Coast, where no one knew her past, where the rains were gentler and the air carried the clean scent of pine and the sea. And there she did the thing she had not dared to do through all those years of running. She took back her real name, the name her parents had given her before her life turned into darkness, the name she had been forced to bury beneath 3 false ones in order to survive. She enrolled in a trade course, something so simple and ordinary that the very ordinariness became a miracle to someone who had spent far too long knowing only flight and fear. And with each day that passed in that new life, she picked up another small piece of the woman she should have become if fate had not been so cruel. Before she left, the two of them met one last time at the Meridian Diner, the place where everything had begun, and they sat across from each other in the diner that had now become familiar, beside 2 steaming cups of coffee, and a silence that was not awkward at all, but full of understanding. Salvatore placed an envelope on the table and gently pushed it toward her, and before she could react, he said that this was not money to buy her silence, not compensation, not a cord meant to bind her, but simply a means for her to be free, so she could begin again without worrying about the difficult first months, so she could have the right to choose, a right life had taken away from her for far too long. Delia looked at the envelope, then at him, and for a moment she meant to refuse, the reflex of someone who had learned that accepting anything from another person always came with a price. But then she looked into his eyes and saw no possession there, no condition, only a pure kindness she had finally learned to recognize and receive, and she nodded, softly thanked him, and put the envelope away. Then, before standing, she took a small, carefully folded piece of paper from her pocket and placed it in his hand, closing his fingers around it, and she told him not to read it now, to read it when he needed it most, when he stood before a door and did not know whether he should step through. Salvatore did not ask what she meant. He only nodded and tucked the piece of paper into his breast pocket, directly above his heart, unopened, keeping his promise as though keeping something sacred. They said goodbye outside the diner beneath the twilight sky, not with tears or promises of meeting again, but with the rare peace of 2 people who had walked through darkness together, and were now stepping into the light by different roads, each carrying a part of the other inside their heart. When the car carrying Delia gradually disappeared down the road leading west, Salvatore stood still for a long while, then turned and went back into the diner, to the table in the corner where he had sat for 12 years, and he ordered 1 final cup of black coffee. But this time he did not drink it all. He only took 1 sip, then let it slowly go cold, and when the evening light had gone out completely beyond the window, he stood, carried the nearly full cup behind the counter, and with Ruth's quiet permission, placed it on a small shelf in the corner of the wall, an unfinished cup of coffee set beside the diner's old keepsakes, like a tiny, silent memorial to everything that had happened in this place, to the younger brother who had once sat, waiting at that table 12 years before, to the woman who had hidden beneath this counter and found her voice again, and to the man himself, who had finally learned that sometimes the bravest thing is not to drink the cup dry, but to stay. 6 months passed from the day Delia left, and Salvatore Baroni's life had changed in ways he had never been able to imagine during the dark years before. The old empire had been taken apart, the shadowed parts had been exposed and cleansed, and the man whose name had once made an entire city hold its breath now lived a quieter life, a truer one, a life in which, for the first time, he could look into the mirror without having to avoid his own eyes. On a spring morning, when he opened the mailbox, among the lifeless envelopes of ordinary life, he found a simple postcard printed with an image of the West Coast shoreline, and on it there was no return address, only a few familiar handwritten lines he recognized at once. Delia wrote that someone had asked her name today, and that for the first time in her life she had answered with her real name, without feeling afraid, without having to glance over her shoulder, without having to weigh whether that name might betray her, but simply speaking it the way any free human being would, and she thanked him for not standing up and walking away on that rainy night, when the whole world had turned its face from her. Salvatore read those lines again and again, and a faint smile appeared on his face, because he understood that the woman who had once trembled beneath the counter, the woman who had once lowered her head and apologized for mistakes that were not hers, had truly been reborn now, had recovered not only her name but also the person life had once tried to strip away from her. And nothing in this world could have brought him greater comfort than that. And it was that very postcard, that very proof of one human being's resurrection, that gave him the courage to do the thing he had postponed for the past 6 months, the thing he still had not been brave enough to face. He got into his car and drove toward a quiet small town, nestled among distant hills. The address Frank Delgado had given him after every legal barrier had finally been removed, the place where his younger brother Tommaso had lived for 12 years under another name, another life. The drive was long, and all along the road he could not stop wondering how his brother would receive him, whether 12 years of silence could be mended, whether a door that had been closed for so long could still open. When he arrived, the sun was sinking low, staining the small roofs of a quiet neighborhood with gold, and he stopped the car in front of a modest house with a little yard and a maple tree just beginning to bud, and he walked up to that door, then stopped. He stood there for a long time, his scarred hand tightening and loosening again, a lifetime of courage in facing the most dangerous men, suddenly dissolving before this simple threshold. Because no fear is greater than the fear of being rejected by someone we love, and no door is harder to knock on than the one leading to a forgiveness we aren't sure we deserve. In that moment of hesitation, when he had almost decided to turn around and walk away, he suddenly remembered the piece of paper Delia had placed in his hand, her instruction that he should read it when he stood before a door, and did not know whether he should step through, and he reached into his breast pocket, took it out, opened the worn folds, and read. On that small piece of paper, in the handwriting of the woman he had saved, there was only one line, that the man who had taught her not to leave should now please not leave his own door. Salvatore stood motionless as he read those words, and something warm rose in his chest, because he understood that the person he had helped heal was now returning to heal him, that the kindness he had planted on a rainy night had quietly taken root, and was now blooming at the very moment he needed it most, that this was the miraculous circle of compassion, given away and then returned from the place we least expect. He folded the paper again, tucked it back over his heart, drew a deep breath, and raised his hand, the scarred hand of a life full of storms, reaching it toward the door, and at the very moment when his hand was still suspended in the air, before it could touch the wood, our story closes, not with a certain ending, not with a promise that the door would open or remain closed, but with that final act of staying, the act of a human being who had chosen not to turn away, not to run, not to remain silent one more time, without knowing what waited on the other side. And perhaps that is all true courage ever asks of each of us, not certainty about the outcome, only the bravery to take that final step. This story leaves us with a profound lesson, that the dignity of a human being is never measured by status or power or wealth, but by the willingness to raise our voice against injustice, and the grace to remain by the side of the vulnerable when the rest of the world turns away. That the one who seems weakest is often the one carrying the most extraordinary strength, that silence in the face of evil is also a form of complicity, and that it's never too late for a person to choose to become better, to atone for mistakes not by building more glittering things on the outside, but by changing the heart from within, because true redemption always begins in the moment we dare to stay instead of leave. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen together to many meaningful and compelling stories every day. How do you feel about this story, about Delia's courage, about Salvatore's journey of atonement, and about the ending left open at that doorway? We truly hope to hear the deepest feelings from your heart, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts so we can connect with one another. through stories of compassion and healing. Thank you for listening until the very final moment, and may everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.